Welcome back, tactics fans, to Chess Tactic. Today, we are diving into a legendary encounter between two titans of the game, Robert Fischer and Boris Spassky. This isn't just a game, it's a strategic masterpiece filled with tension, sacrifices, and a thrilling endgame race. And we're off! Fischer starts with pawn to king 4, the most classic and fighting opening move in chess. Spassky replies in kind, pawn to king 4. We have a symmetrical start, a battle for the center right from the get-go. White develops with knight to king's bishop 3, attacking the black pawn and preparing to control the central squares. Black's knight to queen's bishop 3, a natural developing move that defends the pawn and prepares to fight for the center. Bishop to knight 5. And there it is, the Ruy Lopez, one of the oldest and most respected openings. Fischer puts immediate pressure on the knight, defending the e5 pawn. Spassky plays pawn to queen's knight 3, asking the classic question of the white bishop, what are you going to do? Fischer maintains the pin, bishop to queen's rook 4. He's not ready to release the tension just yet. Knight to king's bishop 3. Spassky now puts pressure on white's own center pawn. This is all very standard, but the strategic depth is immense. Fischer castles kingside. A crucial move, getting his king to safety and bringing his rook into the game. Bishop to king 2. Spassky calmly develops, prepares to castle, and breaks the pin on his knight. Rook to king 1. A multi-purpose move. White defends the e4 pawn and prepares to use the rook on the open file. Pawn to queen's knight 4. Black kicks the bishop again, gaining space on the queen side. Bishop to queen's bishop 3. The bishop retreats to a safe and active square, eyeing black's vulnerable f7 pawn. Pawn to queen 3. A solid move, reinforcing the center and blunting the power of white's bishop. Pawn to queen's bishop 3. Fischer prepares to build a strong pawn center with d4 and creates an escape square for his bishop. Spassky follows suit and castles kingside. Now both kings are safe, and the real middle game battle is about to begin. Pawn to queen 3. A more subtle move from Fischer. Instead of immediately pushing d4, he opts for a slower, more maneuvering game. Knight to queen's rook 5. Spassky targets the powerful white bishop, forcing it to move. Bishop to queen's bishop 2. The bishop retreats but remains a key piece, ready to spring back into action. Pawn to queen's bishop 4. Spassky challenges white's control of the center and stakes his claim on the queen side. Knight to queen's knight 2. This is the start of the famous Ruy Lopez knight maneuver, aiming to bring this piece over to the king side. Rook to king 1. A very flexible move, preparing to defend the e5 pawn or swing over to other files. Pawn to king's rook 3. A useful little move by Fischer, preventing black from pinning the knight on f3. Bishop to king's bishop 1. Spassky repositions his bishop to a more active square and prepares to challenge white's center. Knight to king's bishop 1. The knight continues its journey, heading towards the g3 square, where it will eye the king side. Bishop to queen's bishop 2. Black's light-squared bishop finds a beautiful diagonal. Knight to king's knight 3. Fischer's knight arrives at its destination, putting pressure on black's king side and center. Pawn to king's knight 3. A necessary move to control the f5 square and blunt the attack of white's knight. Bishop to king's knight 5. Fischer increases the pressure, pinning the knight on f6. Pawn to king's rook 3. Spassky immediately challenges the bishop. Bishop to queen 2. Fischer retreats the bishop, but it's still keeping an eye on the long diagonal. Pawn to queen 4. Spassky strikes in the center. This is the moment the game's character begins to change. Pawn takes pawn on queen 5. Fischer accepts the challenge, opening the king's file. Pawn to queen's bishop 4. And here we go. Spassky isn't just playing for equality. He's sacrificing a pawn to blow open the center and disrupt white's smooth development. This is where the quiet, strategic battle explodes into tactical fireworks. Pawn to queen's knight 4. Fischer responds aggressively, creating his own threats on the queen side. Pawn takes pawn on queen 3. Black opens the c-file for his rook. Bishop takes pawn on queen 3. Fischer recaptures, and his bishop is now a powerful piece in the center. Queen takes pawn on queen 5. Spassky regains his pawn and now has an active queen in the middle of the board. Bishop to king 4. A fantastic centralizing move by Fischer, challenging black's control and attacking the knight. Knight takes bishop on king 4. A forced exchange. Spassky removes the dangerous bishop. Knight takes knight on king 4. White recaptures, and his knight now sits on a powerful central outpost. Bishop to king's knight 2. A good move, putting the bishop on its best diagonal and preparing to challenge white's knight. Pawn takes pawn on queen's rook 5. Fischer cashes in his chips, creating a dangerous pass to pawn for the endgame. Pawn to king's bishop 4. Spassky immediately counterattacks, kicking the powerful knight and opening lines against the white king. Knight to king's knight 3. The knight retreats, but the position is becoming incredibly sharp. Pawn to king 4. Another pawn thrust from Spassky. He's tearing open the center to get at the white king. Knight to king's rook 4. Fischer moves his knight out of harm's way, but also places it on an aggressive square. Bishop to king's bishop 4. Spassky attacks the knight and prepares to put even more pressure on the king side. Wow! Fischer unleashes the beast. Knight takes pawn on king's knight 6, shattering black's king side pawn cover. This move looks incredibly dangerous, but it's a calculated risk to create threats against the weakened king. But Spassky has a shocking reply in store. And there it is, pawn to king 3. What a counterpunch! Spassky completely ignores the knight on g6 and instead drives a wedge deep into white's position. This pawn threatens to fork the rook and knight, and the board is absolutely on fire. Knight to king's bishop 4. Fischer calmly defends, blocking the pawn's advance and offering a queen trade. Queen takes bishop on queen 2. Spassky accepts the trade, simplifying into what he hopes is a favorable endgame. Rook takes pawn on king 3. Fischer eliminates the dangerous pawn and activates his rook. Queen takes rook on queen 1. Check. The final queen exchange. Rook takes queen on queen 1. And we have arrived at an endgame. It's incredibly complex, with chances for both sides. Rook takes rook on king 3. Spassky removes the active white rook. Pawn takes rook on king 3. White now has a weak doubled pawn, but also open lines for his pieces. Rook to queen 1. Spassky seizes the open d-file, a key strategic goal in this position. Rook takes rook on queen 8. Check. Fischer decides to trade rooks, trusting his superior minor pieces. Bishop takes rook on queen 8. Spassky recaptures. Now it's a battle of white's knights against black's bishops. Knight takes pawn on king's bishop 5. Fischer's knight gobbles a pawn and becomes a monster, controlling key squares. Bishop takes pawn on queen's rook 5. Spassky wins back the pawn, but this allows white's other knight to jump into the game. Knight to queen 5. A fantastic centralizing move. Fischer's two knights are now dominating the board. King to king's bishop 1. Spassky brings his king closer to the action, a must-do in any endgame. Pawn to king 4. Fischer improves his pawn structure and restricts black's bishop. Bishop takes knight on queen 5. Spassky decides to eliminate one of the powerful knights. Pawn takes bishop on queen 5. Fischer recaptures, and look at that! He now has a protected passed pawn, a huge advantage. Pawn to king's rook 4. Spassky tries to create counterplay on the king side. King to king's bishop 2. The white king begins its march up the board to support the passed pawn. Bishop takes pawn on queen's bishop 3. A desperate move by Spassky, giving up his bishop for a pawn in hopes of creating chaos. King to king 3. Fischer ignores the bishop for now and continues to centralize his king. King to king's bishop 2. The black king also rushes towards the center. King to queen 3. The white king gets one step closer to the critical squares. Bishop to queen's knight 2. The bishop retreats, hoping to control key diagonals. Pawn to king's knight 4. Fischer creates a second front, stretching the black defenses. Pawn takes pawn on king's knight 4. Pawn takes pawn on king's knight 4. Now white has another passed pawn to worry about. King to king's bishop 3. Spassky's king is active, but it has too many fires to put out. The star of the show has arrived. Pawn to queen 6. This pawn is an absolute monster, marching relentlessly towards the promotion square. Spassky's king is forced into a defensive role, trying desperately to halt its advance. The end is near. King to king 3. The king gets in front of the pawn, but for how long? Pawn to king's knight 5. A brilliant pawn sacrifice to deflect the black king. Pawn to queen's rook 4. Spassky tries to create his own passed pawn, but it's too little, too late. Pawn to king's knight 6. The g-pawn continues its decoy mission. Bishop to king's bishop 3. The bishop tries to get back to help defend. Pawn to king's knight 7. The decoy is now a lethal threat in its own right. King to king's bishop 2. The king is forced to go and deal with the g-pawn. And that is the killer blow. Pawn to queen 7. With the black king distracted, there is simply no stopping this pawn now. It will become a queen, and the game is over. What a masterful endgame by Fischer. A truly spectacular performance from Fischer, demonstrating how to convert a complex middle game into a winning endgame with precision and power. Thanks for joining us on Chess Tactic today, and we'll see you for the next brilliant game.